This conference
Just
will
going to
now
give
be
you a quick
recorded.
update on the
Go ahead, Mark.
So myself and the user group leaders for the UK, we're just going to give you a quick update on the current state of play with the user group in the UK. We've got Neale from Wasabi presenting a session, and Wasabi have kindly sponsored the event. And we've got Dean doing a session for us, just covering protecting running VMs and containers side by side, how you can protect that. Then myself and Ian are just going to give you an update and run through on version 13. Got a Q&A session, and then we've got a quiz with some vouchers provided by Wasabi, and we'll use Kahoot for that, which is Kahoot, if you want to pre-prepare and install that on your phone or have it up on your computer. And without further ado, we'll carry on. Ian, do you want to quickly summarise the VUG stuff from your side of things, and I'll chime in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. So I guess I'll just, for those of you, this might be your first user group event, just to give you a bit of the history and the pedigree of the user group. I mean, so this started way back in 2017. It was on the back of one of the Veeam technical clubs at the time in Edinburgh. It's kind of evolved since then, died down a little bit during COVID, as a lot of things did, and it reignited really last year. So for those of you who have attended these sessions before, you might see there's a slight change in who's running these events. So that I've been here for most of the time. Mark, really glad he stepped in and helped in running the events. So this is his first user group event with us. But last year we had Craig Dalrymple and Michael Paul, who have now both since moved to the green side, working for Veeam. So it's a bit of a conflict of interest for them to be running the event when it's actually a user group event, and we want, a non-biased opinion on the things that we're presenting. So that's where we are today. Got myself and Mark, but we're always looking for new people to either present at these things, or if you're interested in becoming a user group leader, we'd love to hear from you. And I've just seen there's one question there already. So is there any incentive for this session? I mean, if your incentive's to win prizes, then yeah, hang around until the end of the user group session where we've got the quiz and we've got some prizes kindly sponsored by Wasabi, who we'll be hearing from shortly. Just, I guess, a little bit about myself. Veeam Vanguard, been in the Veeam data protection space for 10 plus years. Yeah, Mark, I don't know if you want to give a little bit more info on yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a Veeam legend, so just got renewed today, ironically. I've been in the Legends program for 2 years now. Been using Veeam for probably the last 10 years, and in the infrastructure and data protection business for, I sound really old now, 30 plus years. So yeah, looking forward to hopefully engaging with more of you in the community and driving this forward. We are looking at the future of the user going forward and what we can do in terms of events. And I think the next one we'll be looking to schedule in will be an in-person event, but more will follow once we've got this session out of the way and we've got more firm details for that one as well. I think what we'll do, we'll move on to Neale, and over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Mark. Let's try and do some sharing. Sharing is caring, as they always say.
Yep.
Cool. Let me know when you can see the screen.
Yep.
Excellent job. So welcome everyone. My name is Neale Simpkins, or as you heard Mark say, Nelly. A lot of people in the industry know me as Nelly. In fact, my blog, which you'll see there on the bottom, is nellybite.com. So anything you see today, I do lots of demo sessions and things on my blog. So if there's something that you see that you think, do you know what, I'd like to have a look at that or see a demo of that, you can normally drop into nellybite.com, and I'll have done a demo on it. For anyone that does see anything that you think, actually, it'd be cool to see a demo on that, and it's not on my blog, just get hold of me. It's just Neale at wasabi.com, Neale at wasabi.com, and I'm always happy to put new content up. So I'm the technical lead for the UKI, the Nordics, and South Africa. There's a picture on the one on the right. And today I'm going to give you a basic introduction to Wasabi, because I think a lot of you probably know who Wasabi are, or you've heard of us. So I'll give a basic introduction to Wasabi. I'm going to go over a couple of kind of gotchas, or one big gotcha that we see quite often. And then there'll be some other products that we've got as well. I've done a couple of user groups, and I've concentrated on Wasabi. We decided this time there are a couple of other products that we got that are kind of outside of the backup space, but I'm just going to mention them on some single slides, because you might go, do you know what? While I'm in a backup conversation, that might ring a bell with you. So I'm going to mention some other products that we've got, and one that we've got coming as well. So let's crack on. So first of all, what is Wasabi? For those who don't know, we are a SaaS, a global SaaS object service provider. So that is all we do. We quite often get people coming to us going, hey, you're a service provider. Do you do compute? Do you do this? Do you do anything else? No, we concentrate on the storage space. So, our main focus is certainly backup, archive. We do a lot around media and entertainment. And we'll go through some of the use cases as we go on. But, mostly understand we are a S3 object storage provider in the cloud. So there are three main pillars of Wasabi: price, performance, protection. I'm not going to harp on about these. These are marketing slides. We're not really here to market ourselves. We're here to, get a bit more technical. But just understand we are going to whip through price quickly, because it is very, very important when you're in a conversation with a customer. Performance, no, I'm not really going to harp on about performance. And protection, that's a very important one that we are going to go into a bit deeper. So let's quickly go through the price bit. When David and Jeff, who were the owners of Wasabi, when they set Wasabi up back in 2017, there was one thing that they heard from all of the people they spoke to, that they were unhappy about their current cloud storage provider. And it was all around the unpredictable fees. So if you've ever seen an AWS bill or an Azure bill, it's quite phenomenal. You're not just paying for the storage you're using. There are a load of other charges on there. Egress charges, API ingress charges, API egress charges, tiering charges, data movement charges, small object tax charges, transfer charges, monitoring charges. So when David and Jeff set up Wasabi, they went, do you know what? If we're going to go up against these big boys, we need to come up with a service that offers exactly the same features and functionalities, but gives completely predictable pricing. So that's what they did. They sat around for a few years, worked out how they wanted to do it. They launched our first data center in Virginia back in 2017, and the service was exactly that. It's a cost per terabyte per month, no other charges. So, when they launched Wasabi, the industry went crazy. They went, well, how can you do that? And that's exactly what we do. So yes, this is quite a marketing-y slide, obviously. The numbers do add up. I've got a spreadsheet where I put in all the calculations from from the hyperscalers, and they do kind of add up. We are roughly, 20 to 40% cheaper. 60 to 80% cheaper than those guys. And again, I'm going to harp on about it a bit. No egress charges, no download charges, no API charges, no complex storage tiers. It's a set price per month for the capacity that you're using. So let's get away from price. Obviously, it's great in a competitive conversation, but customers also want to understand, well, under the covers, is it the same? What kind of levels of protection am I going to get? You know, how can you guarantee that you're going to look after my data? So under the covers, we've got a massively scale out architecture. It is our own, well, it's not our own built hardware, it's purchased hardware with our own operating system and lots of other things running over the top of it. If you want to get really technical, give me a call. But basically, we lay out the hardware so that we can completely scale it way, way beyond exabyte scale. So currently, we're at 2.2 exabytes of storage of data that we're looking after globally. And we've got about 3 exabytes of capability currently. Obviously, as more storage comes on board, then we add in more and more capacity. But under the covers, the way we lay out the architecture gives us 11 nines of data durability. So this is the various levels of RAID and erasure coding and other items over the top of that to enable us to lose lots and lots of components, because components do fail. We all know components fail. Disks fail, SSDs fail, you know, HBAs fail. So we can lose a phenomenal amount of components and still the data is durable. Nothing's happened to our customers' data. 4 nines of availability. That's just how much we guarantee our S3 service will be up and online every year. That actually equates to 42 minutes of downtime per year globally that we're allowed, which is quite a very small figure that we're allowed for any kind of maintenance windows or, you know, unpredictable downtime. I'm not going to go too much into IAM and multi-factor authentication. That's just standard stuff that you expect. One thing that we brought out last year that was in my opinion, really cool was multi-user authentication. So we all know what immutable buckets are, or, you know, hopefully we should do. Immutability or object lock is when your data is put into an area and it's locked, whether it's Worm or some other feature of locking it, and that data cannot be changed. And that's absolutely cannot be changed, you know, by anybody. So that's immutability, and we'll talk a little bit about immutability in a minute more. Now, what multi-user authentication does is it stops any attack from inside of anyone deleting buckets that are not immutable. Because you know, you might have a bucket that's not immutable for some reason, and if someone internally or someone gets access into some of the Wasabi accounts, they could potentially delete that bucket and delete all the data because the data in that bucket is mutable. What multi-user authentication does is it adds in a dual level of sign-off before buckets can be deleted. We call it internally the nuclear key. You've probably seen the old films. I think War Games was one of them, if you're as old as me, where you need to turn 2 keys and press 2 buttons on 2 completely different stations before the nuclear weapons were launched. Well, that's what MUA is. 2 or 3 people have to sign off a bucket deletion before it can be deleted when you've got multi-user authentication enabled. It also stops anyone deleting the whole storage account. By default with Wasabi, if you go into this, if you're an admin user and you go to the settings of the storage account, there's a button that says delete my account. If you click that and type in yes, then it will delete the account and it will delete all the data. Multi-user authentication stops that happening. So if someone does try, an admin does go in and go, do you know what, I've fallen out with my company, I'm going to go and delete all of the buckets or delete the whole storage account. They click delete and it will ping off emails to the other users that are part of the MUA system. And unless they click yes, I agree to this, nothing's going to happen. So that's something we introduced last year, multi-user authentication. I don't think anyone else has got that yet. I'm sure other people will in the future, but that was quite good. So we're going to talk about immutability as well. So that was MUA protects you against buckets that are mutable, as in the data in there is not protected. Sorry, the dog's having a dream if you can hear that, and that's not me. So immutability protects you against ransomware, and once data is put into an object lock bucket, that data cannot be changed. So this is great for backups. Obviously, if you make your backups immutable, you put them in a object lock bucket, you get hit with ransomware. They might be able to get into your domain admin accounts and your storage array and encrypt everything in there. What they can't do is delete or change immutable data. So where does that fit with backup? Well, you've seen this slide many, many times, and it's a great slide. Don't get me wrong; it's a really good methodology. 3 different copies of your data, 2 different media, 1 offsite. We all know 3, 2, 1. 1.0 came about a few years ago. The second one is an offline, air-gapped, or mutable copy of your data. Well, we offer that. We offer object lock on Wasabi buckets. And the 0, I don't know why the little graphic didn't pop up. But the 0 was no errors or failures. Now, in my eyes, the way to test a backup is to restore it, try it, test it, do DR tests, make sure everything, all your backups can actually be restored from. Now, remember, we're going to go back to the price question. We do not charge for egress or API or anything like that. So we encourage our customers, certainly our Veeam backup customers, you really want to be doing this. We're not going to charge you for doing testing restores, testing a DR. So, you know, we fit really, really well into this methodology. Certainly 3, 2, 1, but the 1.0, we offer the immutable layer, and 0 errors. We encourage you to check your backups, do your DR test, get your run books in place, because, you know, we're not going to charge you for that, and you really do need to get those run books in place, because ransomware, as we know, is quite crazy at the moment. So I'm just going to talk quickly about a gotcha that we always see. Now, within Wasabi, there are 2 forms of object lock, or 2 forms of immutability, sorry. One is compliance and one is object lock. Now, compliance, it gets enabled at the bucket level, and every single object that goes into that bucket will pick up the compliance lock. So every single object that gets put in the bucket will get a stamp on it to say, right, you are locked for this certain amount of time. Then we have object lock, where we just enable the ability to lock objects, and then it's up to the application itself which objects it locks and which objects it doesn't. Because guaranteed, when you do a backup or when you use any product that uses object lock, it won't actually lock every single object. There are some objects that it will want to change, so it won't want those objects locked. So when you're setting up immutability with Wasabi and Veeam, you need the object lock version, not compliance version. So let's go quickly how you would enable one over the other. So compliance is done when you create a bucket. You create a normal bog standard bucket, and then you go into settings, and you'll see there's a compliance tab, and then you'll see the compliance settings, and you enable that, and you pick a number of days, and you think, yay, my Veeam backup's going to work, and it's going to be compliant, and I'll be immutable, and when I get hit with ransomware, I can tell them where to go. This will not work. I've stolen this, obviously. It will fail because it's locking all the objects, and Veeam doesn't want all the objects locked. It does want a few that it can change, so it's going to fail at some point. In fact, I don't even think you can tick the box in Veeam to say I want to enable immutability, because it will say you haven't got object lock on. So yeah, can you finish this in a month? Yeah, I can fail at any speed you like. So where do we set it? Well, when you're creating a bucket, the second option where it says set properties, there are 2 slide boxes, versioning and object lock. And that's all you have to do in Wasabi. When I'm creating my bucket, both sliders, versioning, object lock, enable them, tab through, go next to the end. You don't need to do any other settings. And then when you're in Veeam itself and you're trying to add in a new Wasabi repository, you'll just see the tick box. It says make my recent backups immutable for a certain number of days. And that's all you need to do. There are documents on this. If you go to nealebyte.com, I've done a demo of this in there. But this is one of the main problems we see with customers creating or trying to create immutable buckets. They set it in here when they should be just enabling versioning and object lock on the bucket when they create it. This cannot be done post creation. So if you create a bucket and then add it into Veeam, and then, you know, after doing a few backups, you go, oh, I should have made it immutable. You won't be able to do this. You'll have to create another bucket and move the data into that new bucket. It has to be done. If you want immutability, it has to be done when the bucket is set up. Cool. So, global storage regions. I think I've got a quarter of an hour left. That's good. So global storage regions, we're currently at 15 storage regions, 4 in America, 1 in Canada, 6 for us in Europe here, and then out in APAC, Tokyo, Osaka, Singapore, and Sydney. So last year we brought 2 new data centers online. These are London 2 and Milan. Being a Wasabi customer, you can use any of our data centers. So even if you've given us a PO in the UK, but you've got satellite offices in the US and Australia, that's absolutely fine. You can go and create buckets in those regions. You can use, you can upload data in those regions as well. We do allow replication between our 3 global regions. So any of our American data centers can replicate to each other. Any of our EMEA data centers can replicate to each other, and any of our APAC data centers can replicate to each other. We don't allow global replication. It's something we're thinking of, but we don't have many customers that want to do it. We have done it on the ad hoc basis with a couple of larger customers where they've wanted to replicate from America to UK. But generally out of the box, when you pick replication, if you want a replicated copy of your data, you'll only see the other data centers within your region. So just to reiterate, the two new data centers last year were London 2 and Milan. Now, how do we look at building a new data center? For those of you who are as old as I am, you might remember this dream. Obviously, for just so I don't upset Kevin Costner, I've put my face over the top of him. I don't know if that's legal or copyrighted, but there we go. So Field of Dreams was a movie around a man who decided to cut up his cornfields in the middle of nowhere to build a baseball pitch. Because in his hearing, he heard someone whisper, if you build it, people will come. Now, Wasabi is not like that. We kind of look for large customers who are ready to come on board, and then we will look at building a data center. It's very, very expensive for us to build data centers. So we, as I said, we look for a large anchor tenant who's ready to come on board, and then, run rate business after that before we build a data center. We are currently looking globally. There are markets like South Africa, like the Middle East, like the Nordics, like South Korea, where we do have large customers ready to go, and we're just kind of lining the ducks up to make sure that it's proper for us to build a data center in those regions. So you will see new regions come on board this year or next year, and again, it will depend where we get the interest to build the data center. Interestingly, if anyone wants to write in the chat when they think the movie Field of Dreams was made, we'll see who's the first one. There's no prizes for it. Some of you might just remember roughly when it was launched. So there are a couple of migration tools. Well, one's really a migration tool. One's really just a networking tool. So we have a product called the Wasabi Cloud Sync Manager. We do get customers come to us saying, hey, do you know what? I've got data in AWS or Azure. I'd like to join Wasabi. I'd like to move my backups to Wasabi. How can I get the data there without having to drag it all the way back on premises and then all the way back up again? Well, we've got a product called the Wasabi Cloud Sync Manager that will let us migrate buckets from other storage providers to Wasabi. So we link into your current provider, AWS. You put the credentials in, then our support organization will move the data for you. Once we've got an absolute sync, everything's in line, then we can you can move your backups and flip them over to Wasabi. There is obviously egress charges out of the hyperscaler. We can't get around that. However, with our Cloud Sync Manager service, we help customers with those egress charges. So the way it works, you come to us, you say, hey, do you know what? I've got 100 terabytes in AWS. I'd like to move it to you guys. I know if I egressed it manually, it would cost me this much. What can you do it for? And then we'll come up with a price, which is normally half the price of the egress they would get charged out to the hyperscaler. So that's a service. If you're interested in it, get hold of a Wasabi person or a rep, and we can talk you through that. And then direct connect. So we are connected to the internet in all of our data centers, and most of our customers come to us over the internet. However, some of our larger customers, Liverpool Football Club, FIFA, Wimbledon, all of the UK universities, they want their own dedicated connections. So we offer private peering between on-premises or cloud environments to Wasabi. And these can be 1 gig, 10 gig, or 100 gig, or multiples of those connections, depending on how much data customers got to send to us, and how quickly they got to get it to us. So let's take the World Cup a couple of years ago. Lots of camera feed data coming to us, needed to be instant. So we had 40 gig connections between us and Qatar to ingest that data. So all depends what the customer wants to do, what kind of data they're throwing at us. We'll work with the customer to understand what kind of direct connect they want, and then we'll work with them to get that set up as well. Obviously, direct connects aren't free. There is a charge to have a dedicated connection, but it's nowhere near as much as most people think it is. Okay, so a couple of other products now we'll talk about outside of backup and just storing the data with us. One is the Account Control Manager, or the Wasabi Account Control Manager. WACM for short, WACM, Wasabi Account Control Manager. Now this was launched as a portal for our MSP providers, so they could take on a capacity of Wasabi and they can then resell it. They have their access to their own portal. Customer comes to them, says, hey, I want some Wasabi. They could just drop into the portal, go, yeah, how much do you want? I'll create you your own storage account very, very quickly, and give you the links and the login for that account. So it's great for our MSP community, because they can, make some very good margin by using the Account Control Manager, because they do have the ability to over provision and oversell the capacity of storage that they've purchased. But it's not just for MSPs. We also use the WACM for enterprise, or we see a lot in universities where a customer who's got multiple departments and really wants to segregate and have multiple storage accounts, but all pulling off one pool of storage. They again can have WACM, and they can create separate accounts for geography, history, computing, IT, whatever organizations they want to have access to the storage. It's a free service. We don't charge for WACM. As soon as you've signed up for a reserved capacity amount from Wasabi, you can just say, hey, I'd like WACM, and then we'll get that enabled for you, so you can go and resell that storage to other people. So just a couple now outside of storage. As I said, we're just adding a few fun bits in just so you can see other things that are available. One is Wasabi Cloud NAS. This is a tier. I call it a tiering gateway. Cloud NAS is a terrible name, because I get a lot of people coming to me going, hey, is it NAS running in the cloud? No, it's not. It's a gateway tiering appliance for on-premises unstructured files. So if you've got a big filer, it might be a NetApp filer or a Synology QNAP, Windows, DFS, something like that, and you want to protect that data, you can put Cloud NAS. It runs on a little Windows server, and then it will just synchronize all of that file data, all that unstructured file data, with Wasabi. So anytime anyone creates a new file on premises, they get a copy of it in Wasabi. So that's the first thing it does. But the really cool thing it does is space reclamation. So once you've got your data replicated, you can then introduce a space reclamation policy, and you can say, okay, any files on premises that haven't been accessed in a certain amount of time, get rid of the on-premises copy. Leave behind the metadata, so leave behind the stub, so if someone does want the file back in the future, they just double-click it and it will return. But just clear out all that old data that people aren't really accessing. So that will then clear out a load of on-premises space to free up a load of, normally expensive on-premises hardware. So that's Cloud NAS. As I said, it just runs there. It protects all your data, and then it also allows you to reclaim, so that you can free up a lot of space on premises and just keep the cold old data with Wasabi. We do the same thing for CCTV. So I quite often, and this is quite a funny one, because normally when I'm doing a Wasabi presentation, and maybe it's around backup, and then I introduce this slide, certainly if it's a large enterprise or a university or school, And I go, oh, by the way, we have this product that will bottom out your CCTV recording system. And they go, oh, how does that work? And I say, well, you introduce it, and then it will synchronize all the data with Wasabi, and then it will stub off the older recordings. So you're only filling up the bucket, your recording server, with new recordings. So whereas you might be only able to record a week's worth of data, because cameras are recording quite high quality these days, you can now just record forever, because it will just send the older, colder recordings out to us, while keeping the hot recordings on your VMS system. So again, I'm not going to go into, obviously this is a Veeam group, so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but yeah, it's great that you can just kind of add it in when you're doing a presentation, and a lot of customers go, oh, that's really interesting, because we do have that problem. Last thing I'm going to talk about, I think, are there any additional charge for the cloud NAS and CCTV software? There is a slight uplift, yes. So the RRP on normal Wasabi storage is $6.99. That's the RRP price. There are differences if you're doing the reserve capacity storage, but the pay-go price for normal S3 storage is $6.99. For Cloud NAS, there's an uplift of $2 because we are now supporting an application on premises, and you can have as many applications running as you want, so you can protect multiple arrays or unstructured file data across lots of different sites. So Cloud NAS is $8.99, and then the CCTV software is $10.99. So the reason the CCTV software is more is we actually have done lots of integration with the VMS providers to allow us lots of additional functionality as well. So whereas Cloud NAS, we're just literally saying, right, point Cloud NAS at the shares and we'll synchronize those shares with Wasabi. With Surveillance Cloud, we have actually done lots of integration with the VMS providers to give us lots more functionality that you can actually drive from within inside the console itself. So hopefully, Gary, that answers the question. So there is an additional per terabyte per month charge for NAS and CCTV. One I didn't mention, later we launched a product called Air last year, Wasabi Air. We drew it back a bit because there was so much interest. We realized that we were going to have to slightly change the way that it's architected. So we withdrew it or stepped it back, and it's going to be relaunched again this year. And Wasabi Air is a metadata tagging platform where you'll upload all your data to Wasabi, whether it's video content or audio or documents. It will scan everything, and it will give you a searchable metadata, index. So if you imagine you upload, let's talk about Liverpool Football Club, upload 40 years worth of football game footage, and then somebody wants a clip of Ian Rush scoring a goal with the back of his head while smiling in the rain at the Cop End of Anfield. Normally you'd have to look back through lots of videos to try and find that clip. You'll just literally go into your MAM and you go, hey, I want Ian Rush scoring a goal, back of his head, in the rain, smiling at the Cop End of Anfield, and it will just go, yep, there you go, there's the clip you want. So Air is going to be launched again later this year, probably around the end of Q2, I think, and that's what it does. It metadata tags any content that you put in a Wasabi bucket, and then lets you search that with your own MAM or DAM device going forward. So I've waffled a bit. I think I'm getting near the end. One thing to mention, we've just launched some new technical certifications. So if you are a partner and you've got access to the partner portal, you'll see that there are 2 new tech certs in there. And not too difficult. One is a basic Wasabi technical cert, so you can go through the learning track of that. And then the second one is, remember, the Wasabi Account Control Manager, which is the learning track 2, so you can go through that, and then you can get a nice little technical certification that you can go on LinkedIn like everyone does and brag about it, so people will just keep scrolling past you on LinkedIn. But they're available now. They're quite good. There's some really good technical questions that the SE team from Wasabi helped to design. And that, you'll be glad to know, is the end of my waffle. So again, if you, my blog is nellybyte.com, so if you're interested in seeing demos of any of the products, or if you want further information, the email, I'll pop it in the chat, is just neale@wasabi.com. Hopefully that was useful to you, and I will hand you back to Mark.
Excellent. Thank you very much, that Nelly. Some really useful and pertinent information there. So, yeah, thank you. So that brings us on to our next session. Dean has kindly volunteered his time. And Dean, over to you.
No problem. Let me sort out screen sharing and all of that jazz. Cool. And the last presentation was going on, the issues with Google Cloud resolved themselves, which means I can now run the virtual machine. So that's handy. Dun, dun, dun.
Timing is everything, as they say.
So, window, that one. Right, perfect. So, I was asked to come and talk to you all a little bit about what are the options if you're looking to move away from your current hypervisor. And this is obviously a very prevalent topic for a lot of people because of the Broadcom acquisition of VMware, costs going up. It's a really great time to kind of look at moving into the cloud. There's this thing called Kubernetes that, you know, a lot of people are really interested in. They're already doing stuff with. They've already got dev teams internally who are already using it. In a way, you know, some of the things I experienced personally is like it can be a bit like shadow IT. So we remember this concept, which is you've got teams that to go off and do stuff without telling you as the IT department. It can be like that with Kubernetes as well. So they can come in and you know, you spin up a cluster in Azure, Google, you know, locally or even on their machine, develop against it, and then all of a sudden at some point you've got to support that as well. I think from a cloud native perspective, which is how do I provide some of those really good fundamental building blocks that you can use when you use a public cloud provider, like, you know, APIs and storage on demand and all sorts. Kubernetes has kind of become the prevalent option to do that, especially on premise, especially moving away from kind of like legacy type infrastructures as well. So with that also then comes, well, if I'm running containers in one platform and I've got my virtual machines in a completely different platform, what the hell do I do? And that's where we kind of come in with something called KubeVirt, which is predominantly the technology that we're going to focus on today. A little bit about myself. So I work for a company called Isovalent. We are the creators of the open source Cilium and Tetracon projects based on eBPF, which essentially is a way to run code securely at the kernel level. It means we bypass a lot of the application use space. So a lot of the inherent issues that you see with some software platforms are pretty much gone when you kind of use ours. We've become the de facto networking stack for Kubernetes, essentially using Cilium. And as Isovalent, we offer an enterprise version of that as well. And last year we were purchased by Cisco. And from my point of view, kind of I focus on everything from that world, but my background was focusing in virtualization at VMware for a number of years. So today's agenda, I'm going to keep it really simple. We're going to do an intro into what is this running VMs and containers side by side, focused on the KubeVirt project, the basics of that, looking at storage, looking at networking. Because this is the Veeam user group, we're going to talk a little bit about using Veeam and Cast for data protection. And then I'm just going to give you some links to finish off with of how you can get hands-on to kind of play about with it and see what some of those differences are yourselves as well. We're going to rush through this in 30 minutes. So there is a lot to take on. Please, you know, ask questions in the chat or whatever, and Mark or Ian will call them out for me. And I'll try and answer those as best I can. This is more to give you a little bit of a flavor of what that world looks like when you're moving away predominantly from a VMware environment, because I imagine pretty much everyone on this call is pretty used VMware, familiar with VMware. If there's an exclusive Hyper-V user here who's never looked at VMware before, please raise your hand just because I want to know. So yeah, so we're going to start off. So why are we focusing on KubeVirt in particular? So when we think about Kubernetes, Kubernetes is an open source software, which means it's created by a community. Typically, a lot of that community is backed by enterprise companies like Google, like Microsoft, like ourselves. However, you can install, run all of this without having to pay for any license whatsoever. Alongside of that, it also means it's kind of really flexible. So if someone looks at a particular code or a project or a software stack and thinks we can maybe improve that, do that better, you can spin up a new project to kind of fit into that. And that's kind of what's happened with KubeVirt. So as we've seen this need to run virtual machines side by side with containers and virtual machines, people have created a number of options out there in terms of how best to run virtual machines side by side with them. And ultimately, KubeVirt is predominantly the most popular project for that. It's the most actively contributed. And as you'll see as we go through some of these slides as well, it's also got backing from enterprise companies such as Red Hat as well. So we're expecting that if anyone is looking to run containers and virtual machines side by side, this is probably going to be the platform and option that would be the one that you would choose. But again, like anything with the great thing about tech, there's many ways to skin the same cat, and there's lots of options that you could choose from out there as well. So what actually is KubeVirt? So at its basic level, it's just an add-on for Kubernetes. So it requires Kubernetes to be available within inside of your environment. So you're going to be installing this into a Kubernetes-based platform to begin with. And essentially it gives you a common ground for virtualization on top of that. So what it's actually doing is it's providing you a management layer that looks and feels the same as what you would already be using with Kubernetes today to deploy, manage, and run virtual machines side by side of that. Under the hood, so you're thinking about what is the underlying virtualization layer that's running today, and that would be KVM. So KVM is the popular Linux virtualization technology. We see a lot of kind of that stack out there for those people who are kind of not using VMware, not using Hyper-V running Microsoft, for example. KVM would be the next option for this. And essentially KubeVirt is giving you a homogeneous layer to kind of bridge across all of that. Essentially, at a very kind of simplified level, before I break down into that into a little bit more detail, you've got what's called worker nodes. Worker nodes are the same as your ESXi nodes. So these are going to be bare metal hosts predominantly, but you could have VMs running Google or Azure or AWS as well. And they're going to run all of the software on top of them for Linux and Kubernetes. They're also going to have agents and controllers and so forth running inside of that for the management plane, which then would be used for Kubernetes and KubeVirt as well. Unlike VMware, the management is distributed across all of the nodes. You would have some nodes which are elected for what's called a control plane, which is where kind of resources are just exclusively archived for kind of that management type layer inside of those nodes. And then the worker nodes are typically where you're going to be running your workloads themselves, so your actual virtual machines, and the containers that kind of do web services or databases or whatever as well. And going forward, once you've got all of this up and running, if we kind of skip ahead into the future, it's as simple as you would run kind of like an app. Could be just a virtual machine running. It could be a layer of a virtual machine and a few containers, or it could just be a number of containers as well. There's kind of no differentiation from that point of view in terms of how you would deploy, manage, run that, or what it looks and feels like to your developers or application teams. If we dive down, so I've taken a nice architecture picture from this website here. I would recommend going to this website if this is an area you're really focused on as well. There's a couple of great blogs on there actually explaining some of the kind of core fundamentals behind the scenes of how KubeVirt works as well, and some of the Linux calls and so forth, if you kind of want to geek out that way. But ultimately at the center, you've got something called the Kubernetes control plane. The control plane essentially is just a distributed API that you would interface with. You'd send your commands, you'd ask it for metadata and create stuff with, and basically it's akin to like vCenter. However, the main component here is there is not a UI for that. When we're running KubeVirt on top of it and we talk about this idea of a plugin architecture, all it's essentially doing is running a couple of extra services on top of there. So some new API services, some new controller and schedule services so that it can handle virtual machines. Kubernetes out of the box already has the schedule and controller. So you can say, I want you to run a container and here's the details of this container you need to create, and it will go off and schedule and run that. The same way you go to vCenter and say, hey, here's the details for a VM, go and create the VM and run it for me. With KubeVirt, it then just extends that so it knows how to run a virtual machine as well. The main difference is here from Kubernetes is it's going to use that KVM subsystem to actually run the virtualization for those virtual machines going forward. There's a couple of other components under the hood in terms of how that works as well. If we look in terms of what actually makes a virtual machine inside of KVM and linking it back to Kubernetes as well. Don't really need to kind of worry about that too much today. But we will just kind of talk high level at some of the top level components, because this will start to make more sense. I'll start to show kind of some of the images and comparisons to VMware as well. So key components, the first thing is custom resource definitions. So inside of Kubernetes, custom resource definitions are essentially a schema, and basically it allows you to define what that virtual machine looks like. As I mentioned before, there is kind of no out-of-the-box UI for most Kubernetes installations. There is some nuances and exceptions with the likes of Red Hat OpenShift, which is an enterprise paid-for offering of kind of Kubernetes, which is managed and built and deployed and supported by Red Hat themselves. So if you were kind of running mission critical applications, you're probably not going to want to run open source software yourself. That's kind of like supported by GitHub issues, for example. So you probably do want to pay, you know, someone like Red Hat for like a managed kind of like deployed off the shelf kind of deployment of that as well. And they have created a UI. But even so, in most environments we go into with customers, we find that whether there's an API, a UI available or not, they're typically interacting with the API. The Vert controller, so essentially that's the scheduler. That's the thing that when you say, hey, here's a definition of a virtual machine, it's going to pick that up. It's going to figure out how it creates that and where it runs it. The Vert handler essentially just monitors the state of the VM and makes sure that it matches the desired specification. So the difference being here is a little bit unlike VMware. With VMware, you kind of create a virtual machine and say, go off and run it. And in the future, it will kind of like, if someone else changes it, you change the virtual machine, you know, whether it's add more memory, power down the VM, power it off, add new storage or whatever it may be as well. It's kind of in that moment in time. With declarative specifications inside of Kubernetes, essentially you are declaring that state and it will constantly reconcile against it unless you change that master copy of what it actually is. So for example, if I go in and say my virtual machine needs to be always powered on, always needs to be on this 3 set of nodes or hosts inside of my environment, and then I move it to a 4th node, it will automatically move it back. A little bit like DRS from that point of view. If we kind of, again, link it back to VMware, the difference being here is like everything is declarative from that point of view. And then finally, you've got something called Vert Launcher, and that runs the VMs. The concept here is within pods, and that's how it kind of bridges across to Kubernetes. It's complex from that point of view, and when I first started looking into this, I kind of thought it's a bit over-engineered. It'll make a little bit more sense when we dive into the networking in a couple of minutes. But essentially, the lifecycle is managed using libvirt. And the reason why that's really important is essentially that links back to using the fundamentals of KVM under the hood. So what it's not trying to do here is recreate the wheel of a lot of virtualization technology that is not known or kind of new into the technology space. It is actually just using that well-defined kind of KVM basis under the hood from that point of view. All libvirt is a set of APIs so that you can basically stop, start, and run VMs when using KVM. Then you're going to have, of course, your additional components such as storage and networking as well on top of that. So how would you kind of integrate and use that storage and where does it come from? Very similar to like VMFS volumes and so forth. With Red Hat documentation, which is really nice, they've actually created this little bit of a table to compare against VMware components. And this was kind of a really good way for myself to moving from the VMware world into kind of this kind of newer world was a good way to kind of get my head around it. So very simply, we'll quickly go through a couple of those. So data store is now called persistent volume plus persistent volume claim. Dynamic resource scheduling is called pod eviction and descheduler. A little bit more of a mouthful, but essentially that's just kind of thinking about how it schedules and moves things around in the environment. That would then be married to something like live migration, which is your equivalent to vMotion over here on the right side. And NSX is a replacement. There's a couple of options there. So there's things like Multus, there's things like OVN Kubernetes, things like ourselves with Cilium as well. There is no like-for-like replacement for NSX. You'll kind of find there's like bits and bats around kind of what that does, and also thinking about what that functionality is that you need to replace that with. The NSX piece is probably the most complex if anyone's looking to move away from VMware into another offering in the market as well. We don't, in terms of storage-based policy management, we have something called storage class, which is basically we have this definition and we can tell it, hey, create me a persistent volume against this storage class, and then it goes off and creates all the parameters with me. To be fair, storage-based policy management was something VMware never really saw used in anger because it was not really complex, but it required a lot of kind of components to support that from a hardware point of view. But ultimately in Kubernetes, I think you kind of like hit the nail on the head of making that a little bit kind of better to work with as well. And then finally, kind of where do we get our monitoring and information with? So again, with the plugin based architecture of Kubernetes, you would need to add something on top of that. With OpenShift out of the box, they have monitoring and metrics available. They deploy Prometheus and a Grafana stack in the back end. You could deploy that as an open source configuration as well if you weren't using OpenShift yourself. You know, to use something more vanilla, and that would be equivalent to vRealize operations or ARIA operations or whatever Broadcom's changed the name to today as well. So as I mentioned, what are the biggest differences already? So on the left-hand side, I think this is a familiar screen for everyone. It's a vCenter. It shows you the hosts. It shows you all your VMs. And that's fantastic. And you can click around, you can make mistakes, but it's kind of pretty intuitive to kind of use that nowadays. It's a really good interface. And the left-hand side, that's typically your interface into Kubernetes. It uses some declarative code either via YAML or JSON files. This is a format in YAML. It looks prettier from my point of view. It looks like quite a lot to get to grips with when you interface with it because you're typically going to be using a CLI or potentially making direct API calls depending on your system that you're involved with. However, like it's once you start to get used to it, if you've been using things like PowerShell and so forth. This is where my animations didn't work in Google Slides. So if you've been using things like PowerShell and so forth, it's not a million miles away and you can start to kind of get used to that as well. It probably took me about a week or so to kind of start to get used to kind of using the CLI and kind of making my way through YAML configs and so forth. But it is pretty intuitive once you do that as well. And there is built-in kind of error checking to make sure that YAML files kind of work the way that you expect them to and so forth. So it will call out errors, but it is the biggest shock point when people are moving from VMware environments kind of to something different. As I mentioned, there is an available UI, which is Red Hat OpenShift. Again, most people don't use that UI. It doesn't look the same as vCenter. It doesn't work the same as in vCenter does either as well. So it's still something to get to grips with. But you can kind of see some familiar elements on the screenshot here. So you've got things like you can connect to a VNC console. You can see it's running. You can go to details of the VM. If you wanted to edit the network it's connected to or the amount of CPUs it's got or memory or so forth, you would go into the YAML here and you still have to edit that YAML file and restart the virtual machine for that to take effect as well. You do have a little actions button, very similar to right-clicking on a virtual machine in vCenter, where you'd be able to stop-start the VM, for example, but you wouldn't click here and say edit settings and have kind of a UI version of that. Maybe in the future, as more VMware customers look to move away to other platforms, you may see other companies actually starting to create more of a VMware-like experience for that. And then finally, this was the screenshot I expected to be next, as I was talking about PowerShell. It can be the same. So obviously, a lot of us that work in larger environments have typically started to automate things because clicking around in the UI can be quite slow, quite cumbersome, and introduce human elements to that, which is typically mistakes. So this was a screenshot I grabbed of just to get VM because I don't have a VMware environment running right this second. So I stole this from a website. But essentially here we can see this is the configuration in a PowerShell kind of data output format. And here is on the right hand side again, the same kind of VM being created in Kubernetes. And you can see actually there's quite a lot of information that kind of maps across, very, very similar when we create this as well. So it's not a million miles away. It just takes a little bit of getting used to from that point of view. So what does it look like when we think about storage inside of Kubernetes? So with storage inside of Kubernetes, you have something called CSI drivers. The drivers are just the way that you would say, how do I connect to this backend storage? And the backend storage can pretty much be very similar to what you expect with VMware. Ceph is a open source storage platform, a little bit like vSAN in a way, but it's not built in at the Kubernetes level. It will be deployed as a separate platform. We can do things like NFS, iSCSI, and so forth as well. From a disk management point of view, you create something called persistent volumes. They're the same as your VDMK files. Provisioning, you'd have thin and thick provisioning inside of VMware. Inside of Kubernetes, you have dynamic provisioning with the storage class, and the storage class essentially, which is the same as that storage policy inside of VMware, would say whether or not it would be kind of allocated up front or not. You can create snapshots, the same as vSphere snapshots, but as we all know, snapshots are not backups. And then finally, because it's important with storage as well, you can do things like live migration, vMotion. It's slightly wrong there. It doesn't require shared storage. You can do non-shared storage vMotion as well. I think it requires the enterprise license for that when you do that. In VMware, if I remember correctly, in KubeVirt, you do need shared storage between each of those hosts. So each host that runs a virtual machine can access that storage to be able to kind of migrate VMs between them. Essentially, the main thing to kind of remember is a storage class defines the provisioning settings. That will be performance, access modes, whether or not it can be used for live migration and so forth as well, and also if it can be snapshotted. What does that look like? So when you create a virtual machine inside of that specification, you're going to create the disks that are attached. And then you would back it here at a volume. And essentially, this is the disk as it's going to be mounted inside of the VM itself. So what's the virtual machine going to see? And then the volume is actually where is that located? So that'd be the equivalent of then saying, this is the configuration on my data store. And then finally, inside of that volume claim, basically you're going to say, create me a volume somewhere, which is my equivalent of VDMK file. And then you're just going to give it that data information about how big it would be, what storage class would it be, what type of access mode would it use. So networking does become a little bit complex because we're using that Kubernetes world. So inside of Kubernetes, we have something called a CNI. So CNI is a container network interface. That's the underlying network platform that you would use. There's a number of them out there in the market today. But essentially, KubeVirt is designed so we can use that out of the box so that it works side by side with containers. There's also a couple of additional more complex options. So for example, if you have additional NICs inside of your host machine, you can carve them up and add them directly into a virtual machine. But that also makes it more problematic if you needed to move that virtual machine between networks. Ultimately, as it stands today, the way that the kind of networking works is going to be more complex out of the box than it is in the VMware world, where you create a vSwitch or a DVS switch, and then kind of like give VLANs and so forth as well. It is an area that pretty much a lot of people are looking to kind of simplify going forward. But ultimately, what happens in terms of running a VM, the Virt handler is going to set up that network infrastructure, and then it's going to connect it to the virtual machine itself, and it will generate a domain XML, which essentially is a configuration file inside of that virtual machine for it to understand how that network interface is configured. You've got two main binding modes. So binding mode is kind of a little bit like when you select kind of the where you're attaching your VM network or so forth inside of VM to. So the first one's bridge mode. So bridge mode essentially creates a layer 2 connectivity between a pod that runs side by side inside of Kubernetes and bridges that connection into the virtual machine. Masquerade essentially is similar, but it nats the traffic. So the IP address between the pod and the VM is going to be different. Why am I talking about pod? So I think this slide makes a little bit more sense. So machine networking can work with the virtual machine. It essentially needs to create a bridge from a opposing pod that sits side by side with the VM. So a VM is created with a pod, a container at the same time. It connects the pod to the CNI, which is this bottom half at the bottom here. And then inside of the pod itself, it's going to create that network interface from the pod, create a bridge, and that bridge will then be create a tap pair directly into the virtual machine. So essentially, there's going to be a pod which is like almost like an intermediary for it to connect to the CNI going forward. It sounds really complex. It's a little bit to get your head around up front, but ultimately this works in the back end for you. You don't really have to configure or think about this. What does it look like when configuring a virtual machine? So that would be create your interface inside of the VM, and at the bottom you just tell it what network to configure to. So this would be very much creating a virtual machine in VMware, just saying add a NIC. You don't typically configure what it looks like inside of the VM when you create that NIC, but you would add that network, say VM network or VLAN 12, you call it, whatever you've labeled those networks as. These are your network labels at the bottom. The challenges of all of this is there are 1,000,001 options depending on what type of functionality you need, what type of whether it's going to be using ingress for external connectivity into VMs and maybe diverting web traffic and so forth. So that would be, you might be using service mesh technologies, you might be wanting additional networking security like firewalling on top and observability. So how do I get metrics and data out of all of that networking stack as well? And there's 1,000,001 options out there. And then of course you've got the kind of the native building blocks if you're using a public cloud provider as well. From an Isovalent point of view, we've already talked about Cilium. So from a Cilium point of view, we kind of cover all of those use cases. So we do the performance and scale for Kubernetes and VM traffic at high throughput, low latency. We do all of the zero trust and micro segmentation. So think about per pod, per VM firewalling. That would be very similar to what you'd experience with NSX in the VMware world. We do the multi-cloud, multi-data center, multi-connectivity, so creating bridge connectivities across all of those, and then observability. Because we are operating at the kernel level, we can bring all those metrics from the operating system of the host as well at the kernel level, and also without the same penalties running a full monitoring stack side by side with all of that as well. Benefits of running Cilium with containers virtual machines. This will be slightly similar with other CNIs that you have, but not all CNIs are the same in terms of the features that they offer. Not even all of them support using KubeVirt and running virtual machines at the same time. But ultimately, the first one that we see as an ask from customers is communication between containers and virtual machines, that observability using the same stack without having to introduce additional tooling, the ability to have ingress resources. So that's how do I have like load balance type services without having to go off and get brand new load balancers or brand new software to do all of that as well. And then do all the fancy things like sharing load between virtual machines or virtual machines to containers, securing that access through there, blocking off certain recursive paths and so forth. Zero trust implementation using network policies. So what can talk to what, and so forth. And then the final one, which obviously is a really simple feature, I think from a VMware point of view, is live migration, the ability to move the virtual machine between Kubernetes nodes. But this is a feature which has kind of like newly developed in this world from a cloud native point of view. And kind of VMware hit the nail on the head when they did this years ago, but it's still taken a while for everyone to kind of like catch up from that point of view as well. So yeah. So finally, because we've had 1,000,001 slides, data protection. So where do we go if your teams are now looking to run virtual machines inside of this new platform, which was a hell of a lot complex to kind of get your head around, and kind of we've rushed through quite a lot of that as well. How do you protect those? Are you looking to protect containers? Are you looking to protect VMs? Are you looking to protect both at the same time? And where do we start? Well, I'm going to be honest with you. The answer is it depends, and it really depends on what your starting point is. So we can look at it from two ways. So we can look at it from the starting point of, are we just running a small number of VMs to keep the application team happy who are using containers? Or are we looking to fully migrate across into a new VMware platform that isn't VMware anymore? That is one way to look at it. The opposite way as well is to look at your starting point of what is your existing systems already. So if you're just a Veeam user, which means you're using things like Veeam VBR, you'll maybe using Veeam Agent. You might be using some of the Veeam cloud products as well, like Veeam Cloud Backup for Azure and AWS. And you're moving away from VMware, running machines somewhere else. Ultimately, VBR out of the box does not protect containers directly. All VMs running in Kubernetes, it doesn't have a hook to speak to the Kubernetes API like it does for vCenter and Hyper-V and Proxmox and whatever else is coming in the future. So your probably best option there up front is, as you slowly start to see VMs being run in Kubernetes environments, is use the Veeam agent. If you're using the universal licenses, you've probably got some scope there to kind of move things around as well, which is fantastic. Use the Veeam agent inside the guest OS, connect it back to your VBR server as the repo, or the VBR server as the management engine for kind of the policies that go to that. And just back it up there, as you can start to do that as you grow them VMs. If you are looking at kind of a wholesale larger platform lift and shift to Kubernetes environments with VMs running side by side, and you also need to protect those containers that are in there, then this is where you need a container native backups. This is where Veeam Kasten comes into this. This is where you are going to have to look at kind of a new platform in terms of backing up and managing, because it does require a kind of a new thought process from that point of view. Veeam Kasten supports OpenShift virtualization. So that's the enterprise kind of option that a lot of people go for, which is based on KubeVirt. Also does support KubeVirt out of the box as well. Veeam Kasten can protect containers and VMs that run inside of that Kubernetes environment. It gives you similar types of options as well in terms of running scripts inside of the VM and so forth, similar to VBR as well. So you've got some nuances from there. You can essentially kind of like create a similar looking feel and protection methodology that you had when you were running the VMs, maybe in a VMware, a Hyper-V environment, and protect it with Veeam. And Veeam Kasten also gives you the ability to use the VBR server and repos as target storage as well. So again, you're not really suffering a massive amount of sprawl by like, hey, I've got Veeam VBR here for VMs running in my legacy platform, this new Kasten thing running over here in a Kubernetes platform, and I've got all these extra kind of backup things to think about. What does a VM backup look like, or even a container backup look like inside of Kasten? Slightly different, but essentially the same. If you're already using or tried Kasten with containers, it looks and feels the same when it's a virtual machine in terms of how it captures that data and so forth, and then restore it. But it will be slightly different to how you configure that into a VBR server, because it's more based on metadata and artifacts inside of a Kubernetes environment. What does it look like if you join that to VBR? So essentially you point it at VBR server, it discovers the storage there, you tell it which repo to use, and then inside of the VBR server itself, you can actually see when backup sessions happen, passing data there. And again, another quick stolen screenshot of this, but you can basically see some data as well, that job process. The last bit, which I didn't grab the screenshot of, just because I was playing about trying to get the cloud VM working in the background if I needed it. You in the VBR server have the ability to restore at a file level as well, the same way that you would for like agent and VMs as well, which is really cool. So you can actually restore data using the VBR console rather than having to go into Kasten. However, if you had a failure, an outage, or an accidental deletion of a VM running inside of your cloud native platform, like Kubernetes platform, if you wanted to restore that as is, you would do that in the Kasten interface. Okay, so I think I've been speaking for about 32 minutes now, according to my little counter in the corner. So good news is the slides are over. We do have a hands-on lab that is free to access, that you can use KubeVirt with. You can create a VM, you can play about with the networking on it, you can create some network policies, create how you would manage kind of like load balance access into that VM, and expose things and so forth, and do a little bit of a live migration. It is run in our Itavalent platform, so unfortunately we don't have Kasten in there side by side, so you can play about with the data protection pieces. But for anyone that's kind of interested in that, it's free to use, and I encourage you to do so. And yeah, that's it. That's my slides done. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dean. That's been really useful. I think it just goes to show there are options other than the major hyperscalers out there.
Yeah, let's say that there's obviously there's kind of a lot to go through in 30 minutes. But ultimately, for anyone who wanted to sit down and kind of learn this properly, outside of getting on maybe a lab set up, if you've never worked with any of these technologies before, a couple of days and you'll kind of be at the point where it's like, okay, I understand the differences and nuances between like VMware, Hyper-V, and potentially even that thing called Proxmox, and this, and kind of some of its limitations and how kind of people would use it. One of the things I get asked quite a lot is like, do I need to understand Kubernetes to do VMs in this way? And the answer, unfortunately, is kind of yes. Don't need to be a Kubernetes expert though. Like, I'm not a Kubernetes expert, I don't feel, especially with some of the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis. But again, kind of, understanding the basics of Kubernetes and those constructs and artifacts and how they work and interact with one another is a really good start. Getting kind of a mini lab set up and play with it from there, and then, start to build on those other building blocks as well.
Yeah. Perfect. If no one's got any other questions for Dean, we'll move on. And thank you, Dean. That was brilliant.
Perfect. I'll stop sharing.
We'll jump back onto the agenda. Myself and Ian are just going to give an update on what's in the public domain at the moment for version 13 as well. We'll move along. Ian, do you want to pick this one up for the moment?
Yeah, I'll run through it, and I appreciate everyone still hanging around and listening to all of this. I know we're getting towards the end here, but we have a couple of bits to cover off. As Mark mentioned, this is in the public domain, so if you frequent the Veeam R&D forums, this is where this information's from. I've accredited the source at the bottom there if you wanted to check it out yourself. But with Veeam backup and replication version 13 on the horizon, the R&D team, the product team at Veeam are making a concerted effort to give us, the end customers, the end users, as much notice as possible as to what's likely or what will go end of life, or which features are going to be deprecated, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So I thought it would be nice just to share some of the highlights from the end of life portion of that forum. And if anyone wants to get involved in this conversation, please come off mute if you've got any questions or concerns or feedback on what we're talking through here. I'm all up for open discussion here. But just a few highlights. The hypervisor OS support, like the rule of thumb here really is anything that's going end of life or end of support by the vendor, be that VMware, Microsoft, Nutanix, etc. Veeam's pretty much dropping support for that, and I don't blame them. Like, if you've got an issue, I'm sure we've all been here, you're trying to fix something. You've got three-way support calls going with the vendor, Veeam, yourself. If the vendors wash their hands of the product, what you're supposed to do. So I think it's a sensible decision by Veeam to drop those things. But one thing I did come across, which I thought was worth sharing, when I was researching some of these end-of-life dates, was the website I've linked to there, endoflife.date. Brilliant resource. I don't know about yourselves, but previous roles I've had trying to figure out end of sale, end of life from different vendors' websites was a bit of a mission. Someone or a group of people have put together all of those dates on that one website. So if some of you manage Windows 10, you can see Windows 10 end of life date is later this year. VCS 6.7's ticked off already. You can see on Veeam backward replication version 12 goes end of life. Like it's all there. It's an excellent resource. But yeah, let's click on the next slide, Mark, unless you've got anything to add to that one.
No, I think that's, you've raised valid points there, and like we'll discuss in the next bit. So with version 13, there's some things that will be depreciated but won't be blockers, and there's some things that are blockers. But I think the important thing for the features that depreciated now in version 13 that aren't blockers, they will be blockers in the next major release as well.
yeah, and I guess one thing here, if you're reading in between the lines with what Mark said, this is just information that's public domain. Obviously, there's other cool things that are coming in version 13, which we can't talk about on this call, but they are coming. So stay tuned, I guess, for additional announcements from Veeam. I guess close to the Veeam in April. That's when those things will become public domain. But what's out there now is, and I found this one quite interesting, was deprecating the reverse incremental backup feature. I'm interested if anyone on the call still uses that. And I stopped using reverse incremental a while ago, but it caused some discussion on the R&D forums. That's for sure. A lot of people use it. They like to have the ability to have the latest restore point as a full backup. Makes writing to tape easier in their mind, and those kind of things. But reverse incremental comes with its own penalty. There's higher I/O when writing those things to disk. So I could see why Veeam's dropping it, but it's interesting nonetheless that it's going away. Non-per VM backups as well. So the VM backup chain is each VM within a backup job is its own backup set to restore from. Like way back when Veeam first came out, if you had a backup job of 10 VMs that landed on disk as one backup file, like that methodology's being deprecated. And then the sequential tape processing is going away as well. So if any of you use tape, I'm sure you've got tape libraries with multiple tape devices within the library. The option to write to those tapes sequentially will be going away. Veeam agents, and this is a theme across a few things as well. The retention policies, Veeam is also removing or proposing to remove retention based on number of restore points. So let's use an example here. You want 7 restore points. If you have a backup job that runs 7 times in one day, you're only going to have a backup for 1 day's worth of retention. Now that's going to change to number of days only. So using the same example, if you chose 7 days and it ran 7 times in a day, you'd still have the full week's worth. So you'd have 49 restore points in that scenario.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning as well that only applies to backups. Replication jobs will still be based on the number of retention points.
Yeah. One other one I thought was worth pointing out as well for Veeam agents is, again, if you're familiar with creating a Veeam agent job, once you've configured the Veeam agent, you often ask, do you want to create recovery media? And that recovery media allows you to perform a bare metal recovery of the system that has been protected with the agent. I don't know about you, but it's a long time since I burnt a CD or a DVD to create any recovery media. It's typically boot from USB or SD card or something like that. But again, one of those features that is going away is the ability to create a bootable CD to perform that recovery. And then last thing on the list there, upgrade blockers, just something to be aware of. Again, backup copy jobs in legacy mode or old Veeam agents prior to version 6. If any of those items exist within your environment today, you're not going to be allowed to upgrade to Veeam Backup and Replication 13. Now, there are other things on the forum. I highly recommend checking them out. We can drop those links in the chat. I'll do that when I finish talking. But that was the highlights I want to call out. Anything you want to add to that, Mark?
No, I think we've summed up the main bits. I'd fully encourage people to go to the forums and just read up on what's coming. If anyone has got any questions, feel free to come off mute. If not, we'll move on to the quiz. Maddie, we'll hand over to you if that's okay to do the screen share.
Sure, Mark.
It's a bit everyone's been waiting for. The prizes. He was excited.
What the points make? Prizes.
I can't play though because I know the answers. That wouldn't be fair.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, Maddie.
Okay, that's great. So if you want to play, just go to the QR code, scan the QR code, use the pin, and get in the game. I saw you have some good prizes in
There's
there.
no QR code on there, Maddie, I don't think.
You cannot see the QR code?
We can see the Kahoot page with the 5 questions.
Okay. That's weird. Let me see. Can you see it now?
No.
No.
I think you're sharing your application, not.
Okay. Let me just share it again. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
I think names start to pop in once they sign up, Maddie, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And we can already see 3.
If there's only 3, you've all won a prize already. So.
Donald Trump, oh my.
Oh, Trump, okay.
I didn't know Donald Trump was with us today. Anyone else? No? Should we start?
Yeah, I'd say let's start.
Wait, there's Donald Trump as well. Okay. Cool. Anyone else? Last call. We're gonna start it.
Let's go.
Okay, let's do it then. Where is Veeam on this year? Oh, almost everyone got it right. Great stuff. And Ed is leading the way. What does VDC stand for? My goodness, everyone got it right. Fantastic. And Ed is still leading the way. Good job. Where were the 2 new data centers Wasabi? Oh my God, that was fast. Opened in 2024. Okay. 4 people got it right. Good job, Ed. What does the acronym WACM stand for? Wow, everyone got it right. Fantastic. Oh no, Ed, what you doing?
Kill Donald Trump.
What backup method is being deprecated in V13? Good job. Gary P. Ed. And Kieran. Congratulations.
Well done, guys.
Well done indeed. What happened to Donald Trump?
That was me. I couldn't really play, so I backed out.
I jumped in as Donald Dump.
Yeah, I thought I can't really win my own prize, so.
Okay.
If the 3 winners just want to message me their email addresses, and I'll sort out the vouchers with them.
Yep, that sounds good. Did you leave your email address in the chat?
I will put it in now. Yeah, you just contact me on that email, and I will sort out your prizes. And thank you.
Cheers for that. Thanks for the session.
Excellent.
Yep,
Hope you enjoyed it.
appreciate you all joining. I'll see you in the next one.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.